Lingua Brutalica is a podcast that uses ethnographic interviews to study language use in the extreme metal community. We are studying a music scene known for its love of themes and topics generally considered offensive, and it is likely that some episodes will touch on topics or opinions some listeners may find tasteless or ethically problematic. Ethnographic researchers aim to adopt the interviewee's point of view so that we can draw out and study the attitudes, beliefs, and practices that are important to them. We want to make it clear that in presenting these conversations here, we do not endorse any of their content. Our aim is to explore the thought processes behind language use in this long-running, international, and yet understudied scene. Hello and welcome to this, our fourth episode of Lingua Brutalica, hosted by myself, Jess Benny-Smith, along with my co-host, Wes Robertson.
Hey, how's it going?
Our episode today is going to be a little bit different to those we've previously released because rather than interviewing a metal musician about their lyrical choices, today we're going to be discussing research on extreme metal scenes conducted by our guest, Dr. Rosemary Overell. Rosie is a lecturer in media and communications at the University of Otago in New Zealand, and her research falls within the fields of gender studies, psychoanalysis, and Asian studies. And importantly, in 2014, she released a book entitled Effective Intensities in Extreme Metal Music Scenes, Cases from Australia and Japan. And this was based on research conducted as part of the completion of her PhD thesis at the University of Melbourne. And this is the work that we're going to be chatting with her about today. So Rosie, firstly, thank you for being with us today. And we're really stoked to have the opportunity to chat to you about this research, given it's certainly been very influential on our own research in the extreme metal scenes in Asia and Australia. So would you mind firstly just kind of giving us a brief overview of your research on grindcore?
Oh, thanks for having me, Jess and Wes. It's really great to meet fellow metalhead academics. So I kind of came to grindcore as a fan and metal as a fan first, and then kind of turned that into a research project, which I think a lot of metal academics do. So I was involved in the scene when I was an undergrad at uni, the local grindcore scene in Melbourne, which was centred around pubs like the Art House and the Tote and the Bendigo Hotel. You guys would probably know better if they're still going. I know the Art House isn't.
100%. Bendigo is still really popular for metal.
Yeah, I sort of miss going to gigs. Where I live in New Zealand, there's not many extreme metal bands, at least touring in this area. But so I was going to gigs and I did a subject called Rock to Rave at Melbourne Uni, which was like a cultural studies of music. And I did a ethnography of a place called the Pink Palace, which was a DIY warehouse, squat turned warehouse living space, which hosted gigs, more on the crusty side, but also lots of grindcore. And so I did that, and my teacher, Alison Huber, recommended I do that for my honours project. So I did an ethnography of the Pink Palace people, and it had closed down, so I looked at gentrification and how that affected music. And then I went on to do a PhD and wanted to keep writing about grindcore particularly, but was interested in this particular thing that I'd noticed, because grindcore is a really small scene, like a subset within broader extreme metal in Australia. But there had been this dynamic between Japan and Australia, particularly Melbourne and Osaka, where there was a few bands sort of coming back and forth and people going over. And again, these were all DIY things. And I thought, well, this is an interesting thing to look at. A kind of minor transnationalism was one of my first sort of conceptual frameworks. And so that's how I came to sort of look at Japan as the comparative example, and the two sort of minor cities, not Sydney, not Tokyo, but Melbourne and Osaka. But I did bite off a bit more than I could chew in a way, because I didn't speak Japanese. So I did intensive classes, first year PhD, at, like a cramming school. I think it's Japanesey it's called, right? And sat in on some undergrad with the first years, and then moved over there to do the ethnographic fieldwork, where I picked up a bit more Japanese, but it's still not very good. So yeah, I came to it as a fan, but also I can go into more detail about my research question, which was around gender and the kind of representational stuff. So I was a woman, I still am, strong feminist, involved in lots of direct action stuff at that time, like the Pink Palace came out of the MUA strikes, which were a particular blockade around stopping Patrick Stevedoring and scab labour. So I was involved in activist politics as well, and feminism was a big part of that. But I had this contradiction, I was jamming along to these songs, loved the mosh pit and all that sort of stuff, and headbanging, dancing, enjoying myself, listening to these songs, which were all sort of, raped with a chainsaw, slowly raped with a chainsaw, was one by Fuck I'm Dead. And one of the bands that I toured with early on, just as a fan, was Vaginal Carnage. And they were all great guys, good allies, comrades, but were singing these, or at least used these signifiers of violent brutalness against women. And I was trying to tease out that contradiction between the written or representational and the spoken, and the affective, so how we actually experience culture like music that sort of pushes beyond what might be written. But there's heavy contradictions and problems with this as well, which I don't think I resolved in the thesis or the book, but I'm still trying to tease out now, more moving using psychoanalysis. But certainly originally it was using affect theory and Masumi and Deleuze and Guattari's work.
Did you initially find any, just from the very, very beginning, pushback on people asking why would you ever study grindcore, or why would you study extreme metal? Was it something that you found, I guess, either in or outside of academia, people thought was just not worth attention?
Absolutely. I mean, again, both of you have probably experienced this in your own academic careers. I had fantastic supervisors and good peers in my department, but certainly I had someone say, oh, why, that's all that cultural studies bullshit. An academic, senior academic, say that within my orbit once, and I certainly got knocked back for things like fieldwork grants, which, I mean, you can go conspiracy theory, but they usually went to people doing Shakespeare and sort of visiting the British Library, things like that, because we were sort of within that model within the English program. So it was cultural studies with English. But of course, they might have knocked me back because my work wasn't good enough too. But, and even, of course, on an everyday level, the people I interviewed, the musicians and fans, were all like, I can't believe you're doing a PhD on this. And in fact, their impulse was often that I was doing a psychology degree, that I wanted to kind of categorise them as sick or aberrant individuals. So a kind of cultural studies or sociology perspective was completely outside their idea of. A lot of them would say, oh, so it's like anthropology, but for white people or something like that. That was a few people sort of framed my work. Or and then my own family and extended family couldn't believe it either. I mean, oh, she's studying what? So that sort of, I guess, is typical. But I guess that's the usual pushback towards humanities and particularly cultural studies type of degrees, which kind of look at our culture with a critical lens. It sort of doesn't fit in the boxes of what academic work might look like. Yeah.
That actually kind of links to the second question we had prepared, which was, how did you find it trying to ingratiate yourself in these scenes? You mentioned that you already had some, connections within the Melbourne or Australia scene, but was there any difference between kind of the difficulties of entering these as not just a fan, but a researcher?
Oh, totally. I felt like coming through the scene, like say from going to all ages gigs, like a young person growing up and then switching and say at 24 or whatever, starting my PhD and saying to people I knew very well, including my partner at the time, okay, well now I'm going to do a qualitative interview, right? Was very difficult and seemed kind of artificial. And I had a few people say to me in Melbourne, oh, you're just looking at us like a microscope, because participant observation, right? I'm at a gig. But mostly people were quite friendly in the Melbourne scene, if not a little perplexed, as I say, with that I had a project going on it. But in general, people were keen to, they were enthusiastic to talk about it. But that was one of the things I found difficult doing the research. And I tried to use tried different types of methodologies to try and break out of that qualitative interview or the participant observation where you quickly write the notes up when you get home by using the at that time, I was using mini discs. This is how long ago it was. Mini disc recorders to give to the participants to kind of do self-recordings, but not, at least in popular music studies, people had done that before, but for much slower type of genres, say classical music or folk music festivals. So people would be perhaps walking around a folk festival doing a kind of self-diary auto-ethnography that would then be given to the ethnographer. But this, I was trying to get the fastness of the gig and trying to close some of that reflective space of language, which is really obviously extremely difficult to do. And also, I was trying to also account for the fact that of intoxication at the gigs too. Like my enjoyment and participation was also like being often really drunk. So coming home and just taking notes wasn't really an option. So I was trying to do it on the spot and remember it through doing grabs with my own mini disc, or I think later I had the iPod with a plug that you could record in the toilets at gigs and things like that. But of course, also I had the extra level in Japan of not knowing the language or the scene very well. So having what I tried, I got the guys to record in Japanese, then used an interpreter to translate it, but he was in the scene as well. So it wasn't, he had some kind of ability to translate some of the more slangy terms. But yeah, it was, and coming in Japan, I was always I was either the researcher or Duncan's wife, because I was married at the time to a guy in a band. But that is also part of, I was sort of seen like that in Melbourne, but had my own identity before meeting my former husband. So in Japan, but of course that also works within Japanese forms of patriarchy too, and entering the space, having to have a kind of apparatus or prop, an entry point. And particularly my brother-in-law at the time, Duncan's brother, was a sort of revered drummer who'd moved to Japan and lived there and played. And that was kind of my parlay into the scene.
So in a number of ways then, would you say the Japanese scene was a bit more, I guess, insular or kind of protective of who was allowed to come in? And
well, I mean, my initial thought would be yes, but of course, when it's another culture and another language, it might always seem like that to the outsider. Plus, so Melbourne's scene was like that, a bit like Sarah Thornton's work on club cultures. I know it's an old text, but I do think it's still important because there's a normalising. Everybody in the grindcore scene in Melbourne would say we're really welcoming, anyone's allowed. And I think I brought up in interviews, you know, this question around feminism and gender. And the men would often go, oh, I can't believe that. Really? You experienced that? I'm so sorry. We want to make it more inclusive. But they were shocked that it could be experienced in another way. And I mean, there's casual modes of sort of policing social and cultural capital as well, you know, T-shirts, who fits in, what you're wearing, who's up the front, all that, who you know, all those sorts of things work within the Melbourne scene as well. But sort of having, what would I say, paid my dues by coming up through it, I had more clout that makes it seem less insular. But of course, looking back, working as a researcher, you look for how those modes of policing or boundary maintenance work, I guess, for sure. And I mean, when I say drinking, there was like two scenes too, because there were people who were totally straight edge who were accepted in the scene as well and didn't get drunk, but they kind of make up for that through, say, their headbanging or their Poindexter expertise, you know. There are other ways of kind of accruing capital apart from drinking, but certainly drinking wasn't, and actually hard drugs when I first started were a major part of the scene, heroin and things. But I think that's shifted. I don't know, you'd know better than me, but weed was certainly a major part of it as well, which I kind of left out of I didn't focus on that in the thesis, but that was certainly a big cultural thing, you know. Going off and smoking in someone's car was a typical sort of bonding exercise. But of course, as was buying around and those typical Aussie bloke behaviours. And in Japan, it was a little bit more formalised. I think I write about after uchiages, right, which you're probably familiar with. These sort of more formalised after parties with quite strict modes of who's buying the drinks and footing the bill. It was often the kohai who were sort of, you know, spending hundreds of dollars after these events, but also having to pay homage to the senior guys in the scene as well. I kind of bumbled in as, I think, also as a white, clearly marked as white, you know, I'm not going to pass as Japanese. And my bad language and being a woman, I had some leniency of kind of bumbling in as the foreigner, of not knowing the rules. And sometimes you could get some really interesting kind of participant observation material through that kind of position as well. But of course that does wear thin, and you kind of have to willfully ignore grumpy faces or energies to sort of continue that as well.
So, I mean, you've started already kind of identifying some of the kind of major differences between, like, you know, the scenes in Australia and Japan. I was just wondering if you could say more about, like, specifically, I suppose, like how brutality itself seems to be constructed across those two spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I found this word kept coming up, and it's funny that now I'm kind of following psychoanalysis and you could think about repetition. But so brutal, of course, or not of course, but is a term in metal that circulates, right? Like, I don't know, there would be equivalent terms in other genres of hip hop or what, like lit or something. I don't know the popular pop music slang, but of course I knew brutal as a descriptor in terms of extreme metal, and as a subgenre, you know, you have brutal death metal, but also people would end a gig in Melbourne regularly, you'd just say brutal and do the horns, and, you know, that was a brutal show. It was, there'd be other ones still, like you demolished the set or other sort of metaphors of sort of violence and aggression, but brutal kept coming up. And then when I went to Japan, see, this didn't sort of come up until, it's kind of iterative, right? I certainly didn't predict that this term would travel, so to speak, but then I was at the shows in Japan and they would use the loan word, burutaru, like katakanized version. and with the same, maybe this is some universal thing, the same horns. And I thought, well, what does it mean? Because I talked to people in Melbourne about what brutal meant to them. And, it was this, again, we can't find the words, we can't describe it. It just means really good. It means a great experience. I actually found there was more really interesting in Japan, where they actually went to experiences of extreme pleasure. So in Japanese, this was the translation, but that it was like an orgasmic experience for these men. Brutal, when you use that term, brutaru, it was kind of saying this experience was like, extreme pleasure. Whereas in Australia, perhaps because it is an English word, there was less kind of, I think they were pointing towards that, some kind of extreme affective experience, but they didn't literally link it to sex. Whereas in Japan, there was, at least from the translation, I'd have to go back over my notes and find what the original Japanese word was used. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it also, it's not just within Japan. Obviously, that word brutal has circulated throughout metal in Latin America, across Asia, and here in New Zealand too. Obviously, well, it's very similar to Australia, but works as kind of, a good signifier within metal. But again, of course, in English has the same usage with true crime and things like that, to mean a kind of literal, the exact opposite of something. That's the worst thing that could happen. And it's interesting because it's a masculinized form, I think, but of course it was a way women in both scenes could kind of claim some kind of capital too by using that word and doing the horns. So
speaking of kind of both of these scenes, I noted that in your book, you talk about how there's, senses of inclusion and exclusion in the scenes, whereas the Japanese scene, for instance, is a bit on the hierarchical side. But in Australia, and this is something that we've noted in interviewing Australian bands, taking things too seriously is often seen as a source of critique. I'm very much recognizing that this question is based on kind of stereotypes of cultures, but given that metal is often seen as kind of a countercultural art form or something that pushes back against mainstream culture, which of course is stereotyped too, it is interesting to me this sort of split seems kind of stereotypical of the two cultures in a way. Do you have any ideas why this contradiction might exist, or based on your experiences, is perhaps this not actually the contradiction that it may seem to be at face value?
Well, I reckon most culture sits within some form of contradiction, like just language, but also most cultural formations, the university is a good example, have some kind of contradiction at their heart. But it was interesting to me how, and I'm interested that you've both said the musicians you've interviewed, in the Australian ones, continue this kind of idea, dominant idea that we don't take things too seriously. It's about taking the piss. Don't get too close to the object in a way. Like that's what I kept feeling, that to be a true metalhead, you couldn't sort of lose your cool and enjoy it too much in Australia. It had to sort of loop back through other types of male pursuits or fandoms, cricket or something, where you could enjoy the sport, but you knew the stats. Again, it is a stereotype, but certainly if you pushed it too far, you were sort of seen as missing the point or not getting it. I mean, whereas in Japan, it was considered a serious hobby. There's a helicopter, so I'll just close it. It was seen as a serious hobby. This, more than shumi, it was this ikigai, right? So they'd often, this was my calling. So they not only took it seriously, but it almost sort of became an essential part of their sense of self. Like getting close to the object was kind of almost, as in playing the music or attending a gig, was like a self-sustaining thing, which I think it was for a lot of the Australians as well. But perhaps it was uncool to say it because it wasn't commonly taken within that scene. Like, there is a documentary sort of relatively recently made about Australian metal. It really showed this. It had guys from Blood Duster, but also some of the older guys from sort of 70s bands. I'm blanking on the name, but there's still this kind of, and also sort of using, foul language or swear words to sort of keep effacing that distance too,
So we actually, that's kind of one thing. I mean, obviously the bands that we've seen take their music seriously, the art form quite seriously, but there is definitely a, for instance, some of them discussed European bands that are just all about metal and kind of distancing themselves. But we actually found the opposite, that swearing is something that a lot of the bands don't like. I think one of the ones that really stuck out for me at least was an artist that we talked to that stated that swearing is for like in between songs or like at the show, but
banter,
swearing on,
yeah.
yes, it's for the banter, but swearing on stage is like, there's no shock value to it because this is Australia. And so they wanted to avoid it.
That's such a good point. I love that it's for in between, that idea that it's marking a liminal space, whereas the proper song or riff, and such a good point too, that it's not transgressive because Australian culture is laced with profanity, but perhaps particularly within even if you broadened it out to rock music, of course, is similar. But again, perhaps there was limitations with language for me in Japan of perhaps missing profanity or obscenity in the like the qualitative material. But often they'd import English words to swear within like the copy of the flyers and things, but it wasn't necessarily sung.
Did you look at the lyrics very much?
Not with the Japanese bands. I did note that I looked at the samurai metal band who sort of was singing soy sauce empires and things like this. But most of them were like they were sort of not really grindcore. They were more like death metal, so they had lyrics. But the other bands mostly had growled or sort of just nonsense vocals in Japan. Though the guy who did the interpreting, Hide, he was lead singer in Infernal Revulsion, and they did sing lyrics. And he'd do them both in English and Japanese because he was quite proud of having both languages. And I think he'd translated another band called Ryokuchi's lyrics. They were mostly about pastoral, a bit like, it was like black metal, but a Japanese sort of version. So, rather than the fjords and mountains, they were singing about they were singing about mountains, but it was Japanese landscapes. I think they were quite short-lived, but they did tour Australia. But they were more sludgy rather than grind. In Australia, the bands I looked at didn't have any lyrics. None of them. They were all noise. The vocalists were making noises, but of course they had detailed song titles, which were often they were either obscene in a sexual way or a violent way, with some exceptions. But then it was like my ex's band Shagnam, they didn't have swear words, but they were still masculine. They were singing about cars. I mean, okay, you could argue cars are not masculine, but the way they were thinking about them was within a kind of, macho car culture of, I don't know, Holdens and Fords or whatever.
Were they a grindcore about cars?
Yeah.
That's subject matter I haven't heard of before.
Yeah. Okay.
So the band was called Shagnam. They weren't like they weren't a hugely influential band, and we're only a sort of sometime band, but I don't know even what the EP is, but I think they've only got one release. It's probably kicking around on some forum somewhere, but they had songs about, one was called The Bronze or something, but it was about cars, but you wouldn't know that, I guess, but it was about a particular tone of Tirana car, a bronze panel beating job. But they had various vocalists. So that was a song from when they had a vocalist who was a car enthusiast. Then they had a different vocalist who I interviewed for my thesis, who he actually was quite articulate about. He was one of the few who did sort of get close to it and said, I really lose myself on stage and I kind of throw everything into it. I don't know what I think about, but people interpret it as violence, because he was quite agonized. He'd wrap the cord round his neck and writhe and really throw his whole body into the performance. And he actually was one of the crew who had lived in Japan too and spoke quite good Japanese. I think he'd also sung in a Japanese band, but more a guest vocalist, yeah.
Oh, great. That's cool. So yeah, regarding the performance aspect, we're talking before about like to the degree to which metal musicians in Australia and Japan kind of take themselves seriously, or avoid taking themselves too seriously. I was wondering, like, to what extent that kind of comes through in the actual performance. Like, for instance, one of the things we've chatted about with other musicians from Australia is that humour is so important when performing for an Australian crowd, whereas that doesn't seem to be as much the case elsewhere overseas. Is that something that you kind of saw coming up in your own data?
Yeah, for sure. I think humour was a key linchpin within the live, well, not even just, also the recorded music was in jokes. The Melbourne Grind Syndicate was an in-joke. References to colourful crime characters like Kay Nesbitt, the Shotgun Makeover was one of the songs by Fuck I'm Dead. So this is kind of the recorded stuff. But then obviously, but on stage, it was a huge thing. Like, people would go to see Blood Duster or Fuck I'm Dead partly to hear the banter and the humour of the live show. Oh, what's Tony going to do? What's Jay going to do? Who are they going to sledge, pay out or take the piss out of? The other bands, but also in jokes about, people's hobbies or jobs or things like this. Even people who weren't in bands, like, so stalwart fans. One guy I interviewed who's now actually in a number of bands, but was a younger guy in the crowd at the time, was a keen fan, but he was kind of brought into the banter, paid out, you're backpack fan, because there'd be hardcore guys who'd come in their big army shorts and they'd wear a backpack. They wouldn't drink, but they'd be right at the front and want to buy all the merch. But sort of sledging him was also making him part of the crowd, and he quite liked that, and he's sort of come up as a significant player in the scene now. But yeah, humour was absolutely vital. Even things like, but it also became a bit of an escape shoot. So everything was, if you criticised it, it was, oh, you didn't get the joke. So Blood Duster's album Cunt, with the woman with the big boobs on the front, and I think it had, a censored, and then they were one of the early uptakers of website design and stuff. They had a merch shop online quite early on, and all the merch was a topless woman holding an LP or something with her boobs out, and to sort of push back on that, they'd say, oh, it's just a joke. I'm really great to women. I'm a lover, not a fighter. One of them said to me, in a quite a sincere way, but also they had, you knew them in real life. They had good seemingly good relationships. They weren't thugs or anything, and even probably weren't pornography consumers, but they kind of liked that idea of, just pushing that boundary. And I think they had T-shirts that said hippie kill squad, right? Again, you'd go, wow, that's really aggressive. And that's because we sort of have a banter with the tofu punks. So punks, crusties who were more like vegans, animal rights and activists, and Blood Duster would mix with all those people, but they kind of had an ongoing sort of in-group fighting. But of course the crusties didn't fight back with Blood Duster Kill Squad, right? They ignored it. Or there were various boycotts, sometimes around gender, like Vaginal Carnage, where Pink Palace stopped them playing there for the final point of that warehouse, even though one of the drummer lived there. His own band wasn't allowed to play there because the group had decided that, it was a collectively run space. But I think gender was laughed off a lot more than something like racism or Nazi stuff. That would be completely unacceptable. That wasn't a joke.
In the Japanese scene, was it similar? Was there very little humor in your sense? I remember in your book you mentioned, for instance, one person decided that they wanted to focus on being a dad, and that kind of got them thrown out of the scene. Were like having relationships or even just joking about things kind of a bit more unpalatable in that context?
Yeah, I think, but again, my lack of nuance with the language would have limited me for understanding the kind of, if jokes had operated at anything more than quite an obvious level. So
sure,
I recorded I'd record banter and video. At that point, I think I had a digital camera. So one band, can't remember, might have been Warhead or one of the older sort of stalwart, again, kind of crusty grind bands. They were known for their banter, but it would be more about public events. So if there was a scandal in politics or something, they'd make a sort of, a broad remark about it. Something blue, maybe using some, like, criticising the government or something, but it wouldn't be taking the piss out of each other. And as far as relationships went, they were mostly single men, or bachelors, I suppose you'd say. Whereas in Melbourne, it was quite heteronormative. And you could have a girlfriend or wife and still be in the scene. Whereas in Japan, it did seem like that would kind of curtail your participation in the scene. But the main factor which curtailed people was if they moved up from working class to lower middle class or middle class professions, salaryman professions, which really demanded too much of their time to be involved in the scene. So that friend of mine, Hide, I'm pretty sure Infernal Revulsion doesn't play anymore, as he's got, this job interpreting for the rugby union squad.
Was it all time-based, or was there also a bit of the scene itself rejecting people that kind of moved, I suppose, up, if you will?
I've really, time would be a factor, but then you'd see salarymen coming in, or at least men in, they could have been, as I say, like lower middle class administrative workers, but men in suits coming in and sort of really getting off in the mosh and joining in and all that, those younger guys. So I guess there was some weekend warrior part of the scene, but to dedicate yourself to being in the band, the amount of rehearsal times on that level was much more than in Australia, where it was kind of like, oh shit, we've got a gig coming up, we better do some practices. Whereas in Japan, it was like, okay, every Wednesday and Friday we have a room booked to rehearse. So there was also a bit more value around like expertise on your instruments, though grindcore, of course, moves away from that in so many other ways, valuing low expertise, like that woman at the conference I was at on Friday saying, well, is this a good grindcore band? Well, that kind of is inverted, but some of the Japanese bands would rehearse that inversion, but also perhaps also have the performance of transgression too. Like there was nudity in both scenes, but I saw more of it in the Japanese scene than the Australian one, like guys completely taking off their clothes and performing, or there was blood in both scenes too, but I saw more of that kind of performed violence in the Japanese scene. But it was, to me, it seemed performed, but of course then again, it was very difficult to collapse into understanding the scene fully, being an outsider.
Was this musicians, being nude, or fans?
This was musicians. I never saw fans taking off their clothes in either scene, but Blood Duster would make a big spectacle of it, like, oh, here we go, he's got his kid off, or they'd all play nude, drenched in, theatrical blood. And you'd sort of, it was more an event, whereas like I went to one band it wasn't one of the bands I interviewed in Japan, but you'd have this huge rotation because there were lives all the time. And it was a long set that sort of went into a jam almost. And the vocalist sort of increasingly took the clothes off and kept getting more and more into the song. And I don't think I even ended up writing about that in the thesis, but that was definitely in the notes.
Yeah, so we were talking before about differences in terms of how musicians in the Japanese context and the Melbourne context kind of interact with the crowd. I was wondering if you noticed any kind of differences between the performance of the self on stage versus, if there's any kind of separation, I suppose, between that performance of the self on stage versus performance of self off stage. If, musicians do see a kind of distinction between their stage persona and their more personal identity, if you like.
Definitely. I was thinking, first up, I just remembered the name of the band where the chap took all his clothes off. It was Reality Crisis, and that just came up on my feed. They're still doing EPs, so they must still be a band that puts stuff out in Japan. So, but that's a good question. So even outside, even in the live house or the gig space in Melbourne, people, I guess, have different personas on and off stage. So you see that quite perhaps self-conscious performance in the Melbourne scene of, say, Fuck I'm Dead or Blood Duster. Time getting in the butcher's uniforms with the blood everywhere, but then off stage, like the costume would be taken off, then they'd be wearing their grindcore uniform of, a band shirt and jeans, and just at the bar chatting with their mates like any other kind of punter. That's another thing, because it's a small scene, as you probably know. Most of the bands are punters and fans as well as but then actually outside the scenic space, there's quite profound differences, which I discussed a little more with the Japanese people, because they often felt that they lived for the music, like no music, no life is a slogan you see in Japan. I think Tower Records even had that, but that idea that they work perhaps a crummy job in the week and then are really keen on looking towards the weekend or the evenings to party or to be in the scene. So I think I mentioned before, many of the male scene members were working class and worked things like stevedoring at the docks, or frita type jobs in the sort of Japanese parlance, such as working at a convenience store. But one of the few women I interviewed was quite interesting. She, in fact, loved metal so much she migrated to Sao Paulo in Brazil. Obviously, there's a big contingent of Japanese-speaking migrants who live there, but of course the metal scene in Brazil is huge too. So, but she, and she was just a fan, not a player, but she would make these, plastic food. You know, in Japan you see, when you go to any restaurant, there's a plastic model of the food to be served inside. And she had a very fine, it wasn't production, it was a sort of cottage industry. Maybe it was particularly special plastic food making, but it was a small outfit she worked for. But she actually did quite enjoy that finer work, and found that, but it was a means to save up the money for this ultimate move to Brazil. But and of course, I suppose most of the people, from what I could gather when I discussed their everyday lives, were compliant with other social norms in their everyday lives, especially in Japan. They were good workers, though in menial jobs, or as one of the participants said, I'm working poor, but he said it waku poa. So he'd done the importation of the word from English, which I thought, wow, I wonder, it's an unusual word to import, but it must have been in the media discourse at the time. And he was actually his job was within the scene. He was a sort of, not even a barkeep. He was the guy who sat on the door and took the, in the Japanese scene, he would have had a small salary for, whereas in Australia, as you probably know, a friend or somebody will sit on the door and not take a wage. So I think they felt there was actually a split in Japan, at least, between their performance of themselves in their everyday life outside the scene, say as the salary man, not as a salary man, maybe the highest they might have been were admin or office people in a company, but say as a worker, and then the band was quite outside that. They weren't in bands with people they worked with, for example. That was a whole other group of friends and colleagues. In Australia, it's a bit different. I guess it depended on the person's job, but many did live a whole life. As I said, there were venues like Pink Palace, which were like houses and venues. But there was also perhaps more ability to be able to get something like the Dole in Australia, where one could have some income and spend the day jamming or doing music-related stuff. Also, if they did work, sometimes it was in music industry. Quite a few of them worked for Shock Records, not as A&R or marketing or anything. They worked in the film and packing section, but could play through Shock. You could play some metal. They said they got into fights with the older blokes who wanted to play Triple M or whatever. But they could play their music and show up to work, say, dressed in the jeans and a big band T-shirt. But then other people who worked in, say, who were teachers, wouldn't wear the band T-shirt if it was a particularly gory T-shirt to work, but would be, sometimes their mates from work, colleagues would come to gigs. There was a bit more of a crossover between their work life and their scene life, even with their parents sometimes dropping in. I remember seeing that too. Like their parents were sort of keen to see what the music was like. And
in the Japanese context, did some of these workers, did they give the sense that they had to kind of hide their fandom in metalness? like at their job or with their friends who weren't in the scene?
I think that was implied. Like, they weren't resentful of it at all. I think they just took that as most people they worked with would have some hobby, whether it's collecting flowers, what you were saying, or dark crystal stuff. But, of course, in Japan, the serious hobbyist will go perhaps more than just a poster. There's that assumption that they all probably have something that is outside the work, and that your work friends, your dorio, is that the word, your colleagues, are different from your friends, your tomodachi. But none of them sort of complained of feeling particularly like it was just taken for granted that you wouldn't be able to, that you had a certain uniform or look that you would have to present and perform at work, and which definitely wouldn't fit the look that they would wear at a nightclub. But say a lot of them had long hair, the men. They were the ones working in low admin. The ones who were doing admin tasks looked like straights, but the long-haired chaps were the ones doing either, like I said, stevedoring sort of labour or free-type jobs. Yeah.
Right.
Of course, in Australia, there is a bit more tattoos and things, a bit more acceptable, strangely, in of course, tattoos are big in Japan, but of course signify something quite different.
Did you find the Japanese scene to kind of have an absence of tattoos compared to the Australian scene, or at least hidden tattoos?
I think they're hidden, right? They'd be on their upper arm or leg. But these are all things which, again, if you were in a job, you would be able to cover. Where in Australia, tattoos were a major part of showing your connection to the scene, and huge element. And often Australians, I knew a few times, when they went on Japan on tour, they would be keen to get a tattoo to commemorate the Japanese tour. Because of course Japan's famous, they weren't getting the traditional technique, but maybe a Japanese style design or something. But I was also thinking about another thing was, I think I put it in the book, I took Keith Kahn Harris's idea of transgressive mundanity, where the scene, the coolness and fun of the hobby of the scene, when it seeps too much into your job, say you turn it into your job, like you open a venue or you decide to do a distro or something, they were interesting people. So they were often like, the performance for them would be on stage, and the sort of admin work around working metal was kind of a site which was, they may as well have been just working an office job it often amounted to. They felt sort of sick of doing things like guillotining things to fit, to paste up an LP cover, because it was all sort of DIY stuff. And one guy I interviewed owned a little standing bar in Amemura in Osaka. So
there's a lot of little small metal bars in that area.
Yeah, he had a metal bar. So we used to go there a lot, knew him quite well. And he'd play Brutal Truth and all these really deep cuts, though. He even had North Korean cassettes he'd done swaps for. Yeah, it was kind of like,
okay.
Yeah, amazing. And he had a small distro as well. And it was, but when I spoke to him, he loved that he could do this. Like, he could sit there and listen to his music all day, have a drink, talk to other people who like that music or not. Sometimes straight people would come in but they often still to give it a go, buy a drink, whatever. But I think he also found it tiring that then he almost had to turn it into something to make money out of, rather than just for fun. It was his primary business. So, and it ended up having to close down, and he, last I heard, is works at a supermarket on the floor he's a manager of a supermarket. Still loves the music and everything, but had to give up the little bar. But in that case, it became a bit of a transgressive mundanity. Like, he was playing this work, but it become this crazy music, but it become kind of work for him. And but so there were a few instances of that kind of thing as well. But I also think it was a bit there's more of a separation in the Japanese scene between on stage and outside and off stage than outside the scene.
I was wondering as well, like, kind of on top of that, like, to what extent did you sense like musicians in both scenes identifying with like their lyrics and their stage performance? I only ask because something that we've discussed with other musicians in the scene in Australia is whether or not their music and their stage persona is really reflection of like who they are as individuals. And something that they've said is that particularly when we're talking about like really violent lyrics and stuff like that, that they're like, well, that's part of like the performance, and it's part of like the music and the entertainment value that I'm trying to create, but it's not really a reflection of like my own desire to commit violent acts or anything like that. It's just part of the kind of play involved in creating that kind of brutal metal experience. Is that something that you saw?
Definitely had the same. That was what was verbalized in or articulated in the interviews, and definitely through that word you use, play, that it's a space, but also it's a performance of a genre, that there's generic rules. Like, if you were playing country music, you might wear, I guess, a checked shirt and dress and hat, a cowboy hat, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean you're spending every night drowning your sorrows in booze because that's the lyrics of a country song or whatever. But say that too, we're conforming to a genre, to be screaming about blood, screaming bloody gore is part of the genre. But they were very much at pains. They sort of recognised, okay, I do sing this that's violent, like obviously, and sometimes particularly violent towards women. But first there would be a common sense appeal to the people I knew. You know me, I'm not like that. But once you kind of common sense appeal to a society and say, okay, well, can you tell me more about it? They say, well, yeah, that's not really me on stage. That's Jay as the lead singer of Fuck I'm Dead. And I'm just having a bit of fun. It's a laugh. I'm adhering to the genre, and I'm pushing the genre in new places by getting more and more brutal, more and more extreme with either the form, so say fast drumming, extreme shifted vocals or something, and the form of the music, but also the form of the content lyrics. How gross can you be? But often I'd also find they displace it as well within the sense, like I said last time, or said earlier, by saying, well, I'm drawing on a local, not a violent act committed by me, but one that was committed by a murderer. So burning of Jandamara O'Shane, again, was like a news story in the late 90s, a young boy who was burnt to death, I think by a family member. And they'd have a song, Jandamara's burning, or fucking Nikki Webster, which is, she'd been the Sydney Olympics virgin, right? Like, so more and more obscene as you could get. Who could make fun of or imply having sex with Nikki Webster, or make fun of this poor young kid who's burnt? But it was kind of like, well, Jay didn't burn them. Jay doesn't want to fuck Nikki Webster, but someone might, and this is not me, Hill might have sung the Jandamara one, but I think, they often saw it, just as something that was, I guess, like an actor, I suppose, or even Irving Goffman's stuff. Have you read his ideas of sociology of on stage and off stage, which we have in our everyday lives, but in this case it's literal, but pretty much switching off once they walked off stage, especially the Australians. The Japanese guys were often, because they had those little mini recorders, they were often exhausted, like breath-wise, but were sort of more, I did feel like I got a more earnest, like I said, they talk about their body, it's like an orgasm, right? Whereas the Australian guys would continue with the jokey performance on those quick mini records.
I noticed, oh, sorry.
No, I'm just, go on.
Well, this kind of leads into the question we had next, because you're mentioning some of the questions of discussions of violence towards women, et cetera. And you have an interesting chapter in your book on the balance between effective brutality, which is often treated as feminized, and then represented brutality, which is seen as more masculine in both scenes. But while this is all, performative in a way, these kinds of discussions, you did notice that in reality, there was aspects of exclusion of women from these scenes in terms of kind of practical, actual literal exclusion of fans. I'm wondering, overall, did you see any key differences between the two contexts in relation to this area? And do you see this kind of changing over time? Like, do you feel, was the Japanese scene a bit more exclusionatory, or was the Australian scene kind of changing in response to maybe getting tired of some of these themes? Did you notice any of this, either, I guess, cross-temporal or cross-cultural contrasts?
Good question. And you both would have more of a knowledge of the more recent, I guess, manifestations of the scene. But when I was doing field work, there was literally less women, both scenes, less percentage-wise, there were less women going to gigs and far less performing. There were more women fans than performers as well in both scenes. But the Japanese scene did actually have more women, though they were less than men, than the Australian scene involved. And including in bands. So, I mean, you can say, okay, bigger population, right? But I saw all female bands, even bands in drag, though I think it would be just drag rather than what we call transgender. They were more like, in fact, they were kind of cosplay outfits.
Right.
That was Star Set 6, which is quite a big Tokyo grind band. So I saw them perform, but cosplaying women. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that was particular. I mean, that was transgressive in the sense of pushing extremities rather than a statement about queer politics or something. But women in the Japanese scene, I found, were more likely to be involved in the mosh pit, though. Mosh was almost more of a sacred space. It was sort of contradictory. It was a special space. Like, you really didn't want to go in there unless you could mosh or do the circle kicking or circle type of moshing. So you sort of had to almost have skill to do it. But if you had the skill, you could go in. And I definitely saw more women doing that. Whereas in Melbourne, the mosh was much more freestyle, free for all. And frankly, it was dominated by men. And also the women I spoke to in the scene would often say they did feel, in both scenes, excluded but not explicitly. Wasn't as though any of the men were saying, we don't want women in bands, or women can't play their instruments. But they would have had comments. So some of the women who played in bands, oh, you play drums well for a girl. Those sorts of comments, which today I think would be called out and, criticised. But back then, the women realised that this was sexist, but didn't really speak up about it. They sort of just, in fact, it's sort of good, they kind of internalise, it's sort of good. That just helps me to play harder so I can keep up with how brutal the guys are. But then I'd talking to women specifically, particularly in Australia, about, okay, this imagery which is quite sexist towards women, but you're up the front here dancing along, enjoying it. What can you tell me about that? Oh, well, I know it's not real, or I know such and he's not like that. But then other women would say, I disagree with it, but I think if I'm happy to, if they're on a lineup, I might not go up the front, or I might go to the front bar and not listen to them, but I'm not going to boycott the gig. But then, of course, there were other women who did boycott particular bands and say, and try and get others to do so too. So have a mass boycott. So around vaginal carnage, that happened. And one of the women I interviewed, Evelyn, who was at Pink Palace and played in True Radical Miracle, which was, I guess, more art metal-y, sort of on the edge of the scene. But she had been going out with the drummer from Agents of Abhorrence, Max. So that was a full grind band. Anyway, Evelyn was a drummer. Evelyn is now they ended up launching the Listen campaign, which I'm sure you've heard of in Melbourne, which was a campaign to address the lack of women and or non-cis people in lineups. And Evelyn, they wrote a great op-ed. It would have been a few years ago, but I'm just sort of pointing out because they were originally a grindcore drummer, but wrote a great op-ed saying, listen, you don't listen to us. Or you do listen and say, yeah, we realise women are underrepresented, but what can we do? So the Listen campaign was to sort of push venues like the Tote and stuff to, when they're doing booking, okay, are there women included? Are there non-cis people included? And that actually sort of took quite off. I think Melbourne City Council ended up backing it, and it ended up moving out of her hands because it also tried to deal with cases of actual violence against women across music scene in Australia. But
that started in the grindcore scene then.
Yeah, it did. I'll try and find her original write-up. I think it was on a website called Mess and Noise, which is now defunct. But I think the page is it's still there in the universe. But yeah, they now still perform, but it's much so far from grindcore. It's singer-songwriter, but it's still experimental. But I guess at the time they were very young as well when I interviewed them. So, and by the time Listen came about, the scene, they'd been in the scene for enough time. In fact, I understood they were sick of it. Yeah, but that representative versus affective brutality is a key thing. And I was, coming back to it, when was it? Yesterday, supervising a student. We're trying to unpack this idea of affect a little bit, and I was thinking about this idea. So, yeah, the idea was that there was an ability to put a difference between the linguistic signifiers, we might say, like using Ferdinand de Saussure or someone, and I'm not a linguist, so I could be picking some random thing, but the words themselves, and kind of disavowing the signified in a way, in favour of the experience they're having in the pit, which is affective. And that is brutal. That's really brutal. That feels great. Brutal, great job. The representational brutal would be a focus where the signifier of raped with a chainsaw is really taken as matching the signified and taken as, okay, he is thinking of or discussing or wants to action a rape with a chainsaw.
Have you read Filipov's Death Metal and Music Criticism?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, her term of, I believe, reflexive anti-reflexivity seems to fit quite well into kind of what you're discussing, perhaps?
I like that too.
Sort of like not reacting as a reaction to the content, and that sort of, I don't react to this because my reaction is not reacting is kind of part of participating. And it's something that I think every metal fan has experienced in, as a listener or lyricist or anyone who, when you're driving your car and singing along to a song that promotes acts that you might not participate in the day-to-day life.
Well, like that, I always think of that scene in Office. Have you seen Office Space?
Oh, of course.
Where he's the gangster rap and he's like, ooh, in that town. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose that's I mean, obviously not metal, but I suppose there's a lot of parallels then to the, especially we're talking about kind of the working class and the hiding it, right? Driving to your job, listening to songs about death and torture, and then working 9 to 5 and coming home.
And metal is always seen as less classy or fashionable or trendy than so other so-called indie or independent music, melodic music. But that reflexive anti-reflexivity is really good too, because it kind of even reminds me of how, we operate in an everyday life. I don't like always quoting him, but Zizek's idea that we say that Starbucks is an unethical corporation. We know that, but we buy the coffee anyway and perhaps put a 5-cent piece in like the jar for the Guatemalans in the we know are being exploited by Starbucks. But I think it's a way that it operates in everyday life, but in a particular way, particularly when you consume a product which has problematic representations. So I didn't, although I found in the Japanese one there was the racist element, right? There was nationalist bands, but they were genuinely nationalists. They weren't. There wasn't reflexive anti-reflexivity. But,
sorry, that actually kind of jumps into a question we were just about to ask. So if you don't mind if I kind of link that in, because one thing we both found very striking in your book is that grindcore, I mean, politics and metal have always had kind of a fraught relationship over, metal, we'd argue is inherently political as the question of politicians decide whether or not we can listen to metal in many countries. But the question of whether or not they can be explicitly political has always been an issue. And talking to some Japanese bands, for instance, I found some that say that there's things they want to say, but they don't really know how. And we had an interview about a month ago with an artist who said that he thought that writing good metal lyrics and writing good political lyrics were two different skill sets. And while they kind of wanted to do both, they didn't think they were good enough at the political one. So they just stuck to the kind of metal stuff. But grindcore has always been kind of explicitly since, the napalm death. And in the Western scene, it's been explicitly extremely left-wing. Whereas when you were in Japan and talking to the Japanese bands, you had a lot of very, very right-wing nationalist grindcore bands. And we thought of a few questions relating to this, but the first is, I guess, did you find nationalism to be a trend in the Japanese metal scene in general, or was it something that was very kind of brewing within the grindcore scene explicitly?
I reckon it was general, because probably the most nationalist event I went to was a night, actually Corrupted played at it, who aren't they're not a racist band, but they were the headliners. But there was a few other racist groups, and some of them were that oi music, like oi punk, which again has a history of being, you've got Screwdriver, being the big one in America, white supremacist band, but also historically in the British scene, oi punk has been associated with white nationalism. So that gig, so more like, I guess it was a punk metal gig. And yeah, some of that samurai death metal stuff verged into it, and even Infernal Revulsion, where the chap I said, who was also my interpreter, he did quite harbour very, it wasn't even casual, right? Yeah, he was a racist, particularly against Koreans and migrants, non-white migrants to Japan, migrant workers from the Philippines, other Asian countries, those sorts of things. And then, of course, there was a venue called Daitorio, I think. I'm not sure, but they sort of had a whole scene of bands that would play there and would have the JIA flag up, and that kind of style, a bit like Nazi style, though not German Nazi, but that World Pacific War era signifiers, and would say between songs, get rid of Koreans. What would be a major thing was the Korean angle. They didn't particularly seem to mind me being in the audience as a white person, but that was a broader, there was grind bands that would play in those lineups, but they'd be broader sort of metal punk lineups. And I didn't get to interview Corrupted on the record, but I had spoken to Chu, who I think was the bassist, informally, and I'd brought it up and he said, oh, we don't agree with that, but it's a good gig. So, I mean, the ethics was sort of like it was a big venue, big crowd, that sort of thing. So, whereas also at the same time, one live house we used to go to, Hokage, was a real heart of this scene, had Food Not Bombs nights. They were much more than what you'd expect of the grindcore scene, with the Dahl and sharing that out. And then they actually organised a summer camping festival. And again, the Food Not Bombs people were there, and that was much more progressive. And none of those bands that are associated with the Daitorio scene, which was that particular venue that had those bands, would come to that. Because that's another thing. In Japan, you often almost had a home live house, like a haunt that you what you were kind of known to play at, though they'd play all places. Oh, they're the Hokage scene or guys. So that, I suppose in Australia you have that, like people who, I love playing the tote, or I know I keep mentioning the tote, but the art house was the other one, though that's long gone.
I think these days maybe the bendy, but
oh yeah, that's definitely a home of people who were mentioning that, this is a new venue coming up and all this sort of thing. So and in Melbourne, definitely much more progressive or left-wing politics, and those guys who were singing dreadful songs about women were all sort of people who'd literally been involved in picket lines, strikes, had the right kind of, and in real life were progressive. But this is often a problem in left-wing circles, dealing with and non-cis, non-straight people sometimes is a problem. Like they can be a good comrade but not quite get it in terms of gender. But that was a remarkable thing, as in I remarked on it.
Yeah, literally remarkable. Well, I mean, where do you think this disconnect maybe comes from? Because I've been interviewing a bunch of Japanese bands recently, and a lot of them start by saying, oh, I didn't care about the lyrics, it was all about the music. But as they become lyricists, they've started reading the lyrics more and more and more. I'm just wondering, did you have any insights on how people that perhaps grew up reading translated Napalm Death lyrics and stuff ended up singing about, I guess, from a perspective that's the exact opposite?
Yeah, I have a feeling like, because I would say that I'd say, what bands were your inspirations? And they'd say Napalm Death, Brutal Truth, various foreign, not foreign, but to them Anglophone bands, right? Then SOB would be the Japanese band that inspired them, and but I'm not sure how many of them had bothered to read and understand the lyrics of those bands. But I mean, they do have songs like quite clearly called like Anti-Corporate, or you know what I mean, that album.
Mm-mm.
I think perhaps, again, you go back to a question of genre. It becomes rendered sort of not meaningful only in terms of its transgressive quality, or and its transgressive quality only works in terms of adherence to generic constructions, i.e. one doesn't have to be against multinationals or be against capitalism. That's just sort of seen as, oh, that's part of the genre, so I'll add some words in here or there that equate to that, to conform to the genre. But in a way, it was sort of rendered the same as, say, copying or riffing off a guitar style or a style of singing or screaming. So
could this even be arguably said like reflexively anti-reflexive political opinions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and it could also, I'd also go as far as say they're reactionary opinions, but they are ways of people sort of negotiating in the world. Like, I mean, the guy who owned the the little bar, the standing bar, he was a member of the Communist Party in Japan. However, from what I have read, that isn't too crazy over there. Like, they are a party people. It's still a significant party, though it doesn't get traction in elections.
Yeah, it's very common when you're just walking around to see Communist Party flyers. And not like I think if I say that for people that haven't been to Japan, they might think like little pamphlets littering the street, but like there's the walls you'll pass that has like every politician's flyer that's in the election. And there's always one that just says Japanese Communist Party. And it's not like surprising or anything. It's just a party.
That's right. That's what he didn't say it in a sense of, oh, I'm showing you my radical credentials or anything. It was just he joined up when he was one of the few who'd gone to university, actually. Mm. He joined up then and had kept up. But yeah, I think it is that reflexive anti-reflexivity. And also I think Michelle writes really well about that, but so does Keith Kahn-Harris in his reflection on his own, his Jewishness, but his love of the the Nazi black metal from Norway, which has always been, that was a thing I asked all of them about, and the Japanese people, did not see any problem listening to that music at all, whereas the white Australians, that was absolutely not acceptable. I would never listen to Varg. No way. I mean, that guy's insane. That's not what we do. And I don't like black metal anyway. And even bands that were sort of, and it was kind of, again, relatively recent, that case, but bands trying to start up doing black metal, like, you might know them still, actually. A guy called Tom and his then wife, Emily. What was the band called? They were a black metal band from Melbourne, but I'm not sure if they still play. But they also had lived in Japan. Anyway, they got a hard time even starting. Their music was not about Nazi imagery or anything like that, but just the idea that they were playing black metal connoted that. So people sort of were, but I think that's shifted now. That I still think people wouldn't openly listen to that music, especially now we can see what people are listening to. You know, on Spotify, I can go to. But I think people in Australia are more open to people performing black metal, knowing not all black metal is Nazi metal.
I think Jess can speak to this as well, but we've seen, black metal kind of explicitly trying to distance itself. There's some been some really, really good black metal coming out from people that are more explicitly progressive, whereas black metal used to kind of hide it. There's a band that we were hoping to interview, but they unfortunately didn't get back to us. Very, very minor. They're called Circlin, and it's I think a Finnish guy, and it's very Lord of the Ringsy, like literally. Singing about it. But when we were looking to interview them, we went on their Facebook page and like it's just this little comment in the corner, like under their bio, says, "I love black metal, not fascism." And I was like, okay, like this seems to be almost a desire to kind of, distance themselves while still, like, we've interviewed some black metal bands in Melbourne, and they've kind of brought up the can't listen to those, or even Googling a band before they like to see if there's stuff that might be out there that
Google before you listen.
Google before you listen. And there's memes that get shared around the community too, like smiling face, I found a nice band, and then frowning face, they're
listen, that they're memeing, like that it becomes another kind of, it's an agreed upon everyday practice that if you're listening to this music, it's worth checking. Then that comes another layer of media production where you're producing the circulation of memes. And I think, and in Japan even, black metal, I sort of would think someone like Goldhammer, which is an all-woman band, they're kind of black metal to me, or Doom maybe. They do have elements of black metal, and they don't sing about they're not nationalists at all. It is more like the pain of life sort of stuff. Endless Nauseous Days, I think, is their album. But though one of them is married to a guy from that scene, but it's I think he's from Satyricon though, not.
All right.
Yeah. Not not a vague type character, but there's
a bit of a gap.
Yeah. Quite a wide one.
Yeah, in fact, to my knowledge, Satyricons actually received quite a lot of backlash from the old school black metal community for being quite like progressive and liking Armani suits and that kind of like consumerism, like anti-underground stuff.
Yeah, I also think that argument kind of does exhaust itself, but I think all subcultures have that story of the sellout, or in Melbourne particularly, again, because maybe I didn't see or get the nuances in the language or remarks that other people were making in Japan, but in Melbourne certainly bands like Blood Duster made fun of bands like Parkway Drive as kind of emo, pop metal, and they did an album shoot where they dressed up as emos and sort of, I think they even played emo clubs for fun. I can't remember. There was a club in Melbourne that used to sort of have a club night of emo back when emo was a really popular genre. They played, and it was like, all these teeny boppers were there, that sort of thing. But I guess that wasn't that they were thinking a sellout from someone who was on the underground, but that some types of metal or hard music were automatically sellouts or less worthy because they were popular. Yeah. But I do remember Parkway Drive being a sort of shorthand for lame.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that kind of relates to another question I was going to ask earlier, which is about, to what degree you kind of view a lot of the practices we're talking about as being kind of specific to grindcore versus, metal in general. Because, something that we've, this is kind of related to our discussion just now, is that something that we've noticed in Australia, for instance, is that there does seem to be very clear divisions between like death metal and black metal and thrash metal and grindcore and so on. Even between like the fans of those bands. I mean, I'm pretty sure that you could probably clearly identify just by looking at someone what kind of subgenre they fit into. But also there's that kind of rivalry between those genres as well. I suppose like we were wondering, to what extent do you kind of like view these practices as being more particular to grindcore versus like something that's I suppose common to all of them?
It's a good question. I mean, at the time I did the field work, there wasn't a huge, I don't think the scene was as big as it is now. So with grindcore, it was often on death metal or with crusty or death metal bands.
Mm-hmm.
And people would come and go, they'd go up the front. There were like a couple of full grind events, including the Melbourne Grind Fest happened, I think, 3 years, which was amazing. And that really was like back-to-back grind. And they had bands from Sydney come down and Brisbane and that sort of thing. But, or say an American or a foreign band would come over who was a grind band, then you could fill it with a grind support band. But sometimes death metal would also be on the lineup. But so I think there was a bit more of a mix, but people would often in the interviews at least say, I hate death metal. It's a boring death metal is worse than hip hop, or boring death metal is worse than even Parkway Drive, because they're so pompous. We guys in grind, we don't take ourselves seriously. We're having a laugh, taking the piss, whereas death metal and even thrash to an extent has that the skill, the value of like the skilled solo or the man or the front man being a big, serious, scary dude like Chris Barnes of Cannibal Corpse or something. Whereas all those guys in grind were singing scary stuff. They were sort of self-effacing and self-deprecating through that jokiness.
Mm-hmm.
But that jokiness, if you're not in on the joke, that can be quite cliquey and exclusionary. But a big thing that occurred, not big, but one thing that occurred while I did the field work in Melbourne, so that was maybe over 3 years if I include the honours project, was some of the chaps, they mostly were tangentially involved in the art scene, avant-garde art spaces. So like at that time, what was there? Like there was a place called Irene's Warehouse in Brunswick. Also even places like Bus Gallery, I think that's still going, and TCB in the city. So these were artist-run initiatives. I think they'll and a few times bands like Agents of Abhorrence, Collapsed Toilet Vietnam, White Horse, so grind bands played at these gallery spaces as an avant-garde performance, provided by the gallerists. And I quite liked those, my cultural capital being perhaps higher in the sense that I was doing a PhD, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I could see, okay, this could be taken as avant-garde art rather than bad music.
Mm-hmm.
But many guys in the scene saw that sort of group of men who were sort of straddling between grind and art as wankers. So, who'd want to play at a gallery? Oh, that's for wankers. That sort of attitude as well. So there was some tension there. though those guys did also play live sets, there was always a bit of they weren't part of the Melbourne Grind Syndicate, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice any kind of sense of fooling around, humor, taking the piss in the Japanese scene, or conversely, any kind of artistic art rock takes on grindcore, or was this something that was kind of Australia focused?
I saw, again, I wasn't sure of some of the nuance. Like one band would tirelessly banter in the set between songs, and the crowd would laugh. And when I recorded it, play it back to the translator or interpreter, and he would say, "Oh yeah, he's talking about sumo wrestlers smoking dope." And as again, it was the news of the day. But they do this band. I wish I could remember their name. It could be Warhead. They're an older, like a stalwart of the scene, contemporaries of SOB. So they'd be guys hitting almost 50 now. They would do things like, he was a real performer. He'd have sake on stage. He had to have sake, and that was brought by the Kohai fans, and he would drink that and then spit it back at the crowd. And particularly this one woman who was, I don't know if you'd call her a groupie, but one of their main fans would come up the front, and it's quite unhealthy really in COVID time, so he'd spit it from his mouth into hers, and then she'd spit it back. And that was kind of, I guess, a ritual, but also a kind of well, I mean, not funny, but he'd also pull big faces, like, I mean, you could push it and say, okay, he's doing, what's this type of theatre? Far out. No theatre, yeah. Those kinds of turns of bass, but I'm not sure if that was his intention. Again, he was it was a working class type of chap, but again, as I said, the banter might have been, I might have been at a disadvantage there, but there was definitely kind of some, towards the art scene, that band Reality Crisis, where I said the man took his clothes off and sort of writhed around, and that night, at least, there were more sort of that art crowd sort of band with projections as well, like experimental film, people doing that, like that, it was an audio-visual show almost. So people were playing with the projector and scratching tape, and then I saw Mersbow a few times.
Oh,
but that was at Namba Bears, which is it was a scene, a venue owned by a guy from, from Boredoms.
mm-hmm.
He also had a grind side act, which I can't remember the name of, but that was kind of a punk metal venue, but it did have noise bands. But I have to say, when Mersbow played, the supports were art bands, and the crowd, or avant-garde noise, the crowd was quite different. I think. Yeah,
I mean, Mersbow is not what I would picture playing at a grindcore scene, and politics as well. I believe like they're a explicit vegan, aren't they?
Yeah. He's even come here to New Zealand, which is bizarre. We barely get any, but yeah, I guess he sort of runs the gaunt. Like I said, for me, I thought, to me it makes sense. I like Mersbow and metal because they're both heavy and extreme music. But yeah, I wasn't seeing the same crew at Namba Bears that night. Whereas usually on a Friday they'd have, I guess because he was a more significant performer, you'd see the same type of blokes, mostly guys, but lots of girls. And the music would be crust, punk, or grind. So there was that sort of, the art stuff didn't, and for instance, that Reality Crisis with the projections that night, from what I can remember, they were heavy bands, they were metal, it wasn't noise, but they were more towards the experimental side. Yeah. But it was in a live space. They weren't like the Australian ones. As far as I know, I didn't look into it in detail there, but there wasn't a sort of crossover with them actually playing at gallery spaces. Yeah.
This is sort of changing topics, but you talked a bit, actually, it's kind of going back a bit to something we discussed, but you mentioned in your book the role of taboo topics in establishing a position as metal as deviant and outsider, exploring topics like we've discussed, rape, murder, etc., being a rebellion and rejection of normative mainstream culture that kind of places metalheads outside of quote unquote decent society. I believe you call them the straights. Is that like those
term?
Sorry, what?
Squares or squares, I might
Squares?
say.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, that's sort of placing the metalheads outside of the norm or the quote unquote decent society. But given that what is considered taboo is quite often culturally specific, we are wondering how bands from Japan, Australia maybe engage or treat topics as taboo in their cultures. Did you notice anything regarding language or just presentation imagery that, or how people spoke at the shows that was different between the two scenes, how Japan and Australian grindcore attempted to be transgressive and kind of outsiders?
I reckon, I think in both spaces, the chatter at the shows was chatter about the scene. So, that was a great set. Oh, have you heard the latest such and such album or whatever? Like they were talking about obscene topics. They weren't, they talk, especially in Australia, of course, where I'm fluent with the language, you talk about matters of the day. In Japan, I found that too. You would talk about music, but it wasn't like they were discussing who their favourite serial killers were or anything particularly more than anyone else would. So I couldn't, but I guess the markings of being outside decent society is through the brutal representations, the signifiers within the musical production element. So their album covers, which would have obscene images. Sometimes the song titles, the typed lyrics, they're often not literally enunciated. The stage craft, blood, guts, all that sort of stuff, or nudity. But I guess the other ways they might do it was living outside decent society through, at least in the Australian scene, rejection of traditional housing spaces, living in squats or shared warehouse DIY spaces. And again, also drug use, plus the at least to a certain extent, again, it's probably not really even possible today, but living on the dole. Like there was a time in the 90s where you could live on the dole, and the early 2000s, and not have too much pressure to go and find a job. You could collect that dole and you wouldn't be forced to sort of go take the job. So they were kind of living, and that would be their everyday kind of transgression of what's expected of you as a willing worker or happy nuclear family site or student, or some of them were students, but mostly I'd say the transgression of decency was through those brutal representations.
Was there a difference between how those representations manifested in the two scenes?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good question. Well, I think in both scenes, the artwork and flyers hinged heavily on obscene imagery of, pornographic images of women, or violent images of death, destruction, either from war or crime. Again, but of course, this also goes back as far as Carcass or something, where they used disgusting images of disease and things like that. But I felt like the Melbourne one, they compounded it almost through things like they'd have, as I think I wrote in the book, the guitar, the drum kit would be decorated with these images as well in some bands, underneath the band where that happened. Whereas in Japan, it's often the live houses gear. People didn't have gear in their own home because they live in small houses. So using the live houses drum kit and perhaps guitars as well. I mean, sometimes they brought that, but they weren't decorated. But and in Melbourne, you'd have things like, as I said, not projections, but some venues had video screens where they'd show Texas Chainsaw Massacre or horror movies, which fit in with the broader aesthetic. Japan, it was more the flyers and posters, because like in every live house, the walls are just covered in posters, and the toilets and the flyers are a much more big thing. Like as you leave every gig, you're handed flyers and even sometimes free CDs from people who want to are up and comers. And they were often obscene, not just in the image, but also in the language. So there'd be things, obscene names, bad language, shit fuckers or vaginal cut. Like they'd sort of be clunkily used, but picking obscene English words to sort of, I guess, again, it conform to the genre, and even right down to the fonts, right? Those droopy, metal.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing. So again, their transgression of decency, but it's a transgression of that, but it's conformist in that transgression. The sort of product that comes out at the end looks similar across both cultural spaces.
And that extends to the language as well, you were saying, right?
Yeah. Even and it's interesting that they import English words to signify the obscenity rather than, although I did do this second round of field work about the Nikkei, the Brazilian workers in the scene in Nagoya. One of their bands was called Puta, which is Spanish for whore, right? So, but in that case, they were, it must be Portuguese for whore as well, because they were Portuguese speakers, but in their case, they hadn't imported an English obscene word, they imported one from their language. So again, these guys were Japanese background or blood, as they would say, but had grown up in Sao Paulo and migrated to work in Nagoya. But again, they weren't using Japanese words to signify it. It was an obscene word from another culture. Who used Japanese names were more like, well, Birushana and Ryokuchi were more kind of like Birushana, I think, is a reference to a Buddhist figure, ancient Buddhist. In a way, they could be, they're not black metal though, they're grind. Ryokuchi is kind of like a grass, some sort of natural thing, but mostly the bands used English, or in the case of Nagoya, Portuguese. Yeah.
Do you find any trends between which bands used Japanese names, which used borrowed English terms? Was there any clear dividing line, or was it just kind of haphazard?
It was a bit haphazard, but I do have to say that venue, Daitorio, which was nationalist, more likely for kanji to be on the flyers, no translation, though sometimes they had English words, but that I think I did do a crunch the data of like collecting the flyers and sort of cataloguing them at one point, and Daitorio had much more on the flyers, so more bands that would that was a major thing too. One of the guys said, well, we don't sing in Japanese because singing in Japanese makes you sound like a Japanese nationalist band. So in metal, in grindcore, connotations of that too. Even if our English is bad, we prefer to sing in that, or at least have those words in the liner notes than the Japanese, because singing or writing in Japanese in this genre connotes a nationalist sentiment. Yeah.
Yeah, I interviewed a Japanese band that actually does sing in Japanese because they do, and that was sort of rare. And part of the interview was actually them distancing themselves from bands that sing in Japanese that maybe have a bit of that bent. They were quite aware of. They've been accused of Japanese nationalism, and they wanted to make it quite clear that that wasn't their stance, despite also being interested in they were interested in samurai and they liked kanji and things like that, but they wanted to make it very clear that they enjoyed touring internationally and wanted fans from around the world and things like that.
Yeah, but it's interesting they have to say, oh, again, I'm aware that this looks this way, and the norm is if you're doing this, signaling this Japaneseness, you could be nationalist. That sort of shows how the foreign language sits as well, to signify perhaps a cosmopolitanism or non-nationalist view.
On a lighter side, I also encountered a band that thought that if you sung in Japanese, everyone would think you're visual K.
Well, that's the other thing, because of course Japanese pop is largely in Japanese. But I think and then visual K, people go, oh, you like Japanese metal, you must like visual K. And I'm like, no, not really. But yeah, I suppose I can understand that too. You're either demonstrating your aspirations towards a crossover hit as a pop visual K pop star, or you want to go fully underground and you're some kind of anti-Korean nutcase. Not nutcase, but purist, yeah. Yeah.
Like, to what extent do they see like their use of English as being, I suppose, directed towards like a predominantly Japanese-speaking audience versus like a more international audience?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I think most of the bands I interviewed had initially started out, well, certainly just considering a local audience, as in a national audience, and had usually toured extensively across the country, even up to Sapporo and those places. But then there was this moment where quite a few toured Australia, and they were very keen to sort of, I remember they asked one of the singers from one of the Australian bands to have a look over their English, or can you improve it, the lyrics wise. And again, it's not the lyrics that you can even hear, it's the liner notes that they're wanting help on, that sort of thing. And yes, all of them spoke, apart from the samurai metal band, about very keen to appeal to English-speaking audiences and to have a chance to tour in those places, particularly America. They weren't sort of, dreaming of big hits, but this idea that it would come over more to Western world if you but had some English elements. And they were all very keen, but the same, I guess, as when the Australians toured Japan, they were keen to sort of try and speak Japanese. So the Japanese, when they visited, were very keen to speak English. But both times the visitors from Japan came to Melbourne, Hide also came, so this interpreter. So there was a bit more reliance on him, though they would try quite hard to pick up English. And then again with the Nagoya scene, the young people in that were often on short visas and hoping to continue playing back in Brazil. They were singing in Portuguese, so of course it had. And the thing of singing in Portuguese in Nagoya was they had Japanese origins, but Japanese speaking first language fans, but also the fans who were also Nikkei as well. One cultural difference I might point out was I remember, so when, I don't know if this is in the book, but it could be of interest, was when the Australian groups would tour Japan, they were billeted with, you know, guys from the scene and taken out to dinner and the uchiages and hosted very well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Australia, the Japanese visitors were the same thing. They'd stay with scene members. But I think a number of times it would come up, and it would come up through Hide's translation. He'd say, they don't feel hosted very well, like they wouldn't be fed properly. There wasn't enough food or fuss about food, like we'll just stop at the petrol station on the Hume Highway on the way to Sydney and buy a pie and just expect the Japanese people to pick something off the shelf to buy. And that was a side of tension. They sort of expected to be not taken to a restaurant, but perhaps sit down in a McDonald's and eat together. And also they found, I think in some cases they had to stay at squats, and that was agreeable to some of the Japanese members. But again, it wasn't till afterwards that Hide sort of communicated that back and said, perhaps the next tour we could have it so they're staying at people's houses rather than, one of the places was called Maggotsville up in Sydney. It's in Marrickville. You know, I
sounds delightful.
Yeah. The phrase used was they did not feel well cared for. And I thought, yeah, there was a sense of what the host should be doing as well. And perhaps also there wasn't an uchiage type thing. There would be like perhaps, oh yeah, let's kick on and grab a few beers, but it would be at everybody's own cost. Less of the sort of celebration. And it wasn't so much, oh, you did really, really well. It was, yeah, great show, mate, brutal. Rather than the uchiage was much more, your solo was amazing, and your take on that, you know, there was a lot more of that talk in the Japanese context. So
it's very interesting to see an ostensibly counterculture genre sort of embodying almost stereotypical business practices.
And I agree with you, but it did work like that in a way. I mean, they were pretty rowdy at uchiage, but then the salarymen get pretty rowdy.
Yes.
But also, yeah, expectations around hosting and who should be footing the bill. I mean, of course, Australians buy rounds and all that, but they probably would have also expected the Japanese visitors to buy their own round for everybody. It was, oh, wait, we're the guests, we shouldn't be buying round, you know, that kind of thing. But also the service station incident was brought up, you know, like just grab a sausage roll and we'll eat it in the car. And they were like, no, you know. And also, that's the other thing. So they took Australian bands on tour in Japan. I didn't go on one of these, but interviewed people who had. And it was almost like a tour of the countryside. So they would show them a beauty spot or say this town is famous for udon. So whereas here it wasn't like, they felt disappointed they didn't get to see kangaroos and things. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Expectation that it would be also, you would show us your country in a way. It wouldn't just be squats, venues and service station. Yeah. Especially they had done that. I get it. They had done that for them when they
yeah. So this kind of relates to just one more question I was kind of interested in asking, is just like, the role of the kind of cultural capital, or in this case subcultural capital, because that's come up like a few times over our discussion of different topics. And I was just kind of, I suppose, wondering to what extent you kind of saw any kind of differences, I suppose, given like kind of the differences in the cultural context of like Japan and Australia, between how members of the scene kind of conceptualize and articulate and employ subcultural capital in order to kind of negotiate belonging to the respective scenes. And
yeah, well, I reckon subcultural capital is such a great framework for thinking of how scenes work, how people experience them, how they operate, and how they flow. And it's such a, I still think Bourdieu's ideas account for how class operates outside of the bottom, your bank balance account. So the biggest person in the scene, like grindcore, may not be the one with the most money, but will have high subcultural capital. So in the Australian scene, that subcultural capital was expressed through material objects. So T-shirts, say a rare, of course there's a market in that. Having a rare run of a T-shirt, or even any T-shirt, a band that aren't local, that, an obscure band, that could give you cultural capital higher. But ordinary subcultural capital would be acquired through material things like clothes. Also objects like CDs, LPs or cassettes, which, even though in the time of Bandcamp and Spotify, though I don't know how many of those bands can afford to be put on Spotify, the object itself still has some value, so materialised through those things, but also materialised in the body, in the habitus, so knowing how to behave in the scene, knowing how to hold yourself, how to mosh, which is, of course, actually, though it looks chaotic, an art form in itself. Where to stand, how to dance or move, and the responses should be right. Yelling brutal rather than play something new, or and even some of the heckles, right? Melbourne's famous for heckling. You'd have very high cultural capital if your heckle landed and you got into the banter on the stage. If you heckled and it didn't land and the room was just silent and no one laughed, you'd have pretty low cultural capital. But it would obviously take a lot to sort of have the heft behind you to have the confidence to do a heckle. And moving through the space is key too, like, drinking the right thing, not drinking. I remember once hearing a bartender say, admittedly, I think it was a friend of mine from uni who'd come along who wasn't a metalhead, and he asked for Long Island iced tea. He must have been an American, very American drink. Sorry, Wes. I don't know. Are you American or Canadian?
I am American. Don't drink too many Long Island iced teas, but I have had one or two in my lifetime, yes.
Where did they ask for the Long Island iced tea? Like, what was the venue?
The Tote, and that girly drink. I don't think a bartender would say that now. Also, because you'd be like, I don't care what you drink, give me money, right? But yeah,
I'm not even sure if
the bartender said. The bartender said, "Is that the bartender?"
Yeah,
that seems like a bad strategy.
Yeah, I know. But admittedly, see, this would be 10 or 12 years ago. So, you want a beer, but even you don't just buy a beer. You buy jugs and have your pot glass and share it. So that was part of the habitus as well. Whereas in Japan, beer drinking rituals are different. And I'm not saying they didn't do that. That one band had the sake and the spitting, but mostly cultural capital there was also materialised through what was worn.
Mm-hmm.
The habitus in the space was different. So, as I said, the mosh was a little bit more organised and people had higher skill sets. So the capoeira style kick, circle kick dancing was, that would be extremely high cultural capital, the guys who could do that. But then it was also quite acceptable, and even I would consider they were revered people who stood at the back and just listened very seriously and almost didn't move. They were considering every note very seriously. They were people who were often invited to a chiage almost as like the critic function in Bourdieu's broader field of culture. Whereas in Australia, the people who stood back, and there certainly were some who said to me, I stand back because I do like to listen, but that wasn't really part of the habitus. You'd be seen as a bit of a prickly, a bit of a no fun, a killjoy, a no fun type, to be standing at the back and not getting into it. And as far as drinking goes, in Japan, people would drink beer, obviously, but also highball, cans, vodkas, but it wasn't a buying rounds culture. You'd buy your own drink, and of course you got a drink with your ticket as well, so you could turn in with your ticket. You got a drink worth I think a 500 yen drink, so it would be a beer, I'd say, from memory. But that case of the girls' drink, the Long Island iced tea, again, that's the nuance you get when you get this, although that's rude in any culture. Like if I heard that, it wouldn't fly, but it was a classic. I mean, in a way, he did really want a beer, because if you want to be here, you've got to fit the habitus, right? But I think that cultural capital was, material in fashion items like memorabilia or merch, but also how people moved through the space and who could move freely, who stood in the corner, who'd be asked up on stage. That was another thing, and probably still happens, share the mic. That happened in both scenes. And as I think I put in that book, often the live houses didn't have raised stages, so it was also quite a liminal space between. But they weren't handing the mic or spitting sake at just anyone. It was, the people who are up the front with the high cultural capital. So, yeah.
It seems to be a bit the same in the Australian scene, like regarding kind of exchanges of like sledging and that kind of thing. It seems to be directed mostly towards people that are recurring kind of characters in the scene who come to all the shows and stuff.
Yeah, the people, and it's often crossover between a performer and fans. So they might be sledging, he's in the audience now, but he'll be up on stage next play. But even sort of like chronic fans, like, I don't know if this guy's still on the scene, Poodle, Dave. He had long dreadlocks. He wasn't a Rasta. It was a more crusty guy, but he
actually, yeah.
He would wear glasses. Do you know what I mean? He'd be quite old now.
My husband probably knows, yeah.
I don't know his surname, but he was known as Poodle. And I don't think he plays in a band, but he'd be up the front and people would always say, what he was famous for is have a beer in one hand and a Jim Beam can in the other. So, yeah, but he'd often get sledged and heckle. There'd be banter between those guys and he wasn't in another band, but he was just such a devoted fan and a guy who stood out because of his long dreadlocks. Very high cultural capital, low economic, the guy wasn't well off, and also high social capital. He knew everyone in the scene. again, that brings you, that sort of coalesces with cultural capital and value in the scene. And you knew how to greet people, you know. I mean, I'd heard people say, yeah, keep it brutal as a goodbye, that kind of thing, or using vocabs language, being aware of the slangs, but also aware of what was happening in the broader grindcore scene globally too.
Makes you wonder to what degree, like, you know, kind of knowledge of those, like, you know, metal memes that we were talking about earlier kind of figure into this cultural capital. You know, something that we see like quite often is like, you know, quite facetiously referring to something as like true vault. You know, when you're kind of taking the piss out of something for being a bit too serious, you know, trying to be grim black metal or something. So yeah, I wonder if today that's something we could look at.
That would be, I think, see, all of that is new post my research, but again, and that's a kind of reflexive take up of something that was meant, since we presume sincerely by Aryan metal and the Kvalt thing, but then it's being reworked as a signified, a sort of in an ironic way. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like if something like, someone's like trying too hard to be like grim and dark and everything, like, oh, so true vault and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
like a Spinal Tap kind of vibe, I suppose. Yeah,
because there were guys who I mean, that was it. I'd say, well, who doesn't fit in the interview? I'd say that to the people interviewed. Oh, the ones who take it too seriously, who just want every flyer and stand up the front and don't mosh. But they could understand they were appreciating it, but they were kind of uncool. But often, I guess, if people were persistent in going over and over again, you would become you'd become more comfortable in the habitus. And I guess there is a pedagogy to it. So you could, I saw guys moving from being quite at the edge of the scene to moving up as well.
And that trying too hard thing seems to go in both directions. Like, you know, you're trying too hard to be kind of above your station, like trying too hard to, you know, be really good, or you're trying too hard to be underground when you're not really that underground, you know, like, I don't know if this is the case in grindcore, but certainly in like black metal, it used to be really, I suppose, in vogue to make really shitty quality recordings, you know, like on like tape decks, that kind of thing, like, you know, well after that media had really kind of expired and stuff. And like that's something that I think was also kind of described as being like, oh yeah, cool man, really fault of you, like to, you know, try so hard and make this ridiculous thing.
Yeah, to sort of get the effect of a sort of background noise.
Yeah, the hash,
crappy tape cassette recordings. Totally, I've heard a few and bought a few of that type. But I do also guess I tend to think of black metal people taking it a bit more seriously.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, you said Grim before. I have a feeling that was the name of the band that these people, Tom and Emily, I knew, started. It could have been called Grim. I'm not sure. I think it is in my thesis. I can't remember what their pseudonyms were, but if you flip through the back of the book, there might be reference to that band. They wouldn't operate anymore, though, I don't think.
Well, Grim seems pretty consistent with what you'd expect of, like, you know, very traditional black metal, like vault kind of outfit.
3 dozen bands called Grim in the world. Yeah, that's interesting, that the sort of revalorization of cassettes. Yeah, and I think if you sort of were aware of sort of saying, oh, I did this, and to get that background sound of, you know, I'm on the fjords or something like that, or in the wilderness, and it has to sound as shitty as possible, and that shittiness makes it good. Yeah, I think if you tried too hard at that, or if you made a fetish of the technology, like going, oh, great cassette player.
Yeah.
seen, I mean, that would be like
Never heard that sentence in my entire life.
Yeah, I know, the fetish of the tape recorder. But if you, to be like cool, at least when I was doing that work, the subcultural capital was in the live performance. And if you were recording, you didn't want it to be that flash, and you certainly weren't bragging about, oh, we've got a great mixing desk or the latest type of effects pedals. Like the only effects pedal you'd want would be something like the pitch shifter, and even people thought that might have been too pretentious. Like that really pared back form. Like even I remember, sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I remember dragging some grindcore fans, my partner at the time, and other that group to again a uni friend who were in a, I guess you call them a prog metal band, or even prog rock. And yeah, they just, didn't like it, weren't mean to the people, but afterwards going, oh, well, they got all those fucking pedals on the floor. That had cost them hundreds. Not just that it was a waste of money, but just that it was just overdoing it, and like you'd having to stop and change the pedals to have these long riffs. Yeah.
Yeah, it's my impression that there's kind of emerging like this kind of separation of the factions between like people in the scene who are like really into making like, really high quality music, obviously very keen on honing their skills and playing their instruments and stuff, and obviously getting the right equipment to kind of produce those effects is going to be pretty integral to that whole process, versus other people on the other end of the spectrum that are more interested in kind of maintaining that classic low production sound and effect, but only in a way that I suppose doesn't suggest that they're trying too hard to do that. Seems to be like, if you want to produce a shitty recording, that's fine, but it can't be something that you're going to great means to do. It needs to be like, oh, just because that's what you had,
Definitely, like it has to, if it's a shitty recording, it has to be really shitty, like shitty, rather than I've made it sound extra shitty because I've got two really amazing TAC tape decks and like there was a guy who had he was not obsessed with, it was great. At the time, this is like maybe MySpace era, he had a really good flash digital recorder of sound, like would have cost hundreds or even 1,000 at that time, and people used to laugh at him, but he was doing a great archive. I don't know where it's gone, I can't remember his name, but he'd posted on MySpace sounds of the live sets, but people would be like, oh, there's such and such with his tape deck or tape recorder, they called it. So there was a split there. Again, he was a fan rather than a player.
Yeah. In closing, is there anything you'd like to say about where your research is going from now?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke a little bit about the stuff I was writing about the Dayton, Ohio massacre. So that's one angle where I'm thinking about how metal is covered in contemporary media as a cause, problematizing that. So sort of returning a little bit to the problems of moral panics arguments, but then trying to sort of nuance it a bit by saying, well, we don't want the opposite thing, which is I'm also collating articles as they come into my field about metal is good for you. I think I put one on Twitter, which is the discourse that metal is good for you, of course, implies that somehow it was ordinarily not.
Right.
And that this is newsworthy. It's remarkable. Metal is good for you, and that it and this is a cognitive science, neuroscience thing where they're tracking people's brain waves to say, oh, it makes people feel good rather than send them into, shooting people. So I'm looking at that. But also I am interested in, I haven't written up the whole material from the field work I did on at Nagoya. So I will be, so that's a return to the Japanese stuff, thinking of how the Nagoya scene operated in this kind of satellite way, where they had a kind of, it was a way they built, they faced a lot of discrimination, being Japanese ethnicity, but not fitting in terms of culturally, but also their language being, first language being Portuguese, and how they have built sort of communities there around metal, which produced a way of belonging with inside the Japanese nation that's kind of at odds with it as well. And also I did that field work, which again I haven't written up, I did a little bit of work in their workplaces, which were in mostly car manufacturing. So actually trying to do a little bit of, it was observation in their everyday life, more observation of their everyday lives and the metal scene. So that's yet to be written up in full. I've only written one thing from that, but it's from a while ago. So I'd like to go back to Nagoya and do more work there. Yeah. So that's my metal angles. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Have a lovely day.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Lingua Brutalica. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stay tuned for our next episode. Before we leave, we just wanted to acknowledge that this podcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.